Eastern, 5 a.m. Pacific Time.
Up next on C-SPAN, you'll see a debate between two candidates running for mayor of New York City. Democratic candidate David Dinkins went up against Henry Hewes from the New York City Right to Life Party in a debate sponsored by WXTV Channel 41, WPIX Channel 11, the National Hispanic Council on Aging, Radio WADO, and El Diario La Prensa. Republican mayoral candidate Rudolph Giuliani did not attend this debate.
From there. Now, dear listeners of Radio Wado, welcome. Dear TV audience of WXTV Channel 41, welcome. And dear readers of the Diario La Prensa, welcome as well as the participants, the candidates for mayor, the members of the panel, and journalists from the entire city of New York are here. So we are very proud indeed to have you in this first Latin debate between the mayoral candidates of the city of New York. The first radio and television debate in both languages spoken in this city in majority. We invite Rudolfo Giuliani, who had accepted 3 weeks ago in writing, so that we went on with the candidate, but later, after that, David Dinkins, Democratic candidate, accepted our invitation, and Mr. Henry Hewes, candidate for the Right to Life party. And unfortunately, Mr. Giuliani has, in writing, told us that he would not participate, and he has maintained this position to the very last moment since Mr. Henry Hewes is participating. The members of the panel who are going to be putting questions are Mr. Gustavo Godoy on the left, who is director of the news department of Channel 41, Sheila Steinbach, who represents WPIX Channel 11, and Mr. Esteban Creste of the Diario La Prensa. They will put questions to the candidates and an answer returned in a 90-second period. The first person to answer a question from the panel will be Mr. Henry Hewes. 90-second answer by the candidate will be followed by a 60-second rebuttal on the part of other candidates. So, following the debate, there will be a minute for each candidate to make a final statement. Something very particular here, which we are proud of in the organization of this debate, is that it comes from an initiative of the community, the National Hispanic Council on Aging. Its New York chapter is presided by Mr. Mario Tapia, and we shall listen to a short message from him. Thank you very much. The New York chapter welcomes you.
Con la responsabilidad que dictan las cifras de una comunidad latina en constante crecimiento y enfrentando candentes problemas que exigen la participación activa de cada uno de sus miembros para buscarle solución.
And direct
buscan dirigir los destinos de la ciudad de Nueva York.
Agradecemos a los candidatos presentes.
Confiamos que los ausentes comprendan que lo de hoy, más que un debate, es un paso necesario de nuestro propio proceso de maduración y participación política. Finalmente, nuestra gratitud a Radio Wado, Canal 41, el Diario La Prensa, Canal 11 por su apoyo y por ocupar su lugar como voceros de una comunidad
for this debate. A well-informed community is a more respected community. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Mario Tapia. The press will have 3 questions following the questions put to the candidates. We shall go straight on to the first question, as we had announced, to Mr. Henry Hewes. This question will be put by the director of the press department, Gustavo Godoy. The fact that you are here this morning is the reason why candidate Giuliani said he would not come. How do you interpret his refusal, and what repercussions can this have for you? Thank you.
Well, I think that Rudolph Giuliani doesn't want to enter into a debate at all. I think that his preference at this stage in the election would be to get a chance to attack David Dinkins in some television studio and make accusations about him. What I'm interested in is having a debate and talking about the issues. And if we talk about the issues, if we talk about abortion, if we talk about pornography, if we talk about crime, the voters in New York State and New York City will find that I am much more conservative and much more in keeping with the kind of family morality which does in fact dominate New York City than is Rudy Giuliani. So I think that he fears that by appearing with me in a debate that he will lose substantial portions of his constituency. I think his not appearing will have the impact of educating the people of the city of New York in a way similar to his appearance. And I think that it will have a very negative impact in general, and I think particularly in the Hispanic community, which pays a great deal of attention to candidates' respect for a forum of this type.
Thank you. You have your opportunity now, sir, to address this point.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be back here again. We have been here before. This debate format is an interesting one. I'm sorry that Mr. Giuliani chose not to appear. I have a copy of the letter of October 5th where he said he was going to appear. He obviously has changed his mind. And I believe that he has changed his mind for precisely the reasons outlined by Mr. Hewes. He suggests that he wants to debate and discuss issues, but the record shows that he spent about $1.5 million on television, largely with a negative thrust, with no apparent desire to discuss issues. I've been a candidate since February 14th, formally. I've been before hundreds and hundreds of audiences discussing issues, responding to sometimes very difficult questions from the audience.
The time is up for that rebuttal. The next question from Channel 11 goes to Mr. Dinkins.
Thank you very much. Mr. Dinkins, last night you called on New Yorkers in a speech that you made before some 1,200 Democrats to pitch in and make sacrifices. You also indicated in that speech that one sacrifice is scaling back a wage increase. What did you mean by that, and was this meant as a message to your labor support?
Well, such messages as I wish to send to labor, I send a bit more directly than that. But the point I was trying to make is that all of us, each of us in our city, must come together if we are to succeed. I would remind people when they say that I am supported by special interests and making reference to labor, and you know the litany, I say, you mean those persons who clean bedpans and tend to frail elderly and mold young minds in our schools, those who staff our municipal offices and drive the buses and cabs and trucks. Those are the people that support me. Now, I would wish people to remember that in the fiscal crisis of the mid-'70s, it was labor in the vanguard of the effort that helped save our city when some counseled bankruptcy. And so I'm suggesting that as we come on to difficult times with projections of a budget deficit perhaps between $500 million and $1 billion, no one really quite knows right now, it means that the private sector, it means labor, it means all of us must come together to try to solve the problems and save our city. And that's all it was meant by that. We need a partnership, a true partnership.
I think that the demands in the city in the next 4 years are going to be extraordinary. The AIDS crisis is going to hobble our hospital system. We're going to have to spend incredible amounts of money in our criminal justice, drug treatment, youth care. We are going to have to revitalize our school system. And I think that what this campaign has lacked up to this point is a clear call from the other candidates to the city to make sacrifices. And it's only by making sacrifices that we're going to make New York a more livable, civilized place. And each and every New Yorker is going to have to extend him and herself in order to help protect and defend the other people in the city. And only through that kind of an extension are we truly going to have a civilized city that works. So I would agree with David that the sacrifice is necessary.
Thank you, sir. The next question will come from the Diario La Prensa. Mr. Esteban Creste will ask the question. Mr. Hewes, the penalization or the legalization of abortion, is that a measure which can be taken by the state authority? Now, in your case, the position you take on abortion, you're looking for a public position as a mayor. Now, how could you respect the law in that case?
Well, I entered this campaign fundamentally because I believe that the 1.5 million abortions that take place in this country each year are the greatest moral horror of our time. And I think that every individual can have an impact, whatever his or her position in the society. The mayor of New York is the leader of the city of New York, and the foremost way in which the mayor of New York, within the law, can fight to end the horror of abortion is simply by being an aggressive public advocate for the civil rights of all people, including unborn babies. Practically, there are several things a mayor can do. There's a health care system which dominates New York City, and if I were mayor, I would make respect for all human life the important factor in appointing people to work in that health care system. And that not only includes babies, it includes retarded children, it includes elderly people. There is about $7 million a year in discretionary city funds that are used to pay for abortions. I would vote against that, depending upon what vote the charter eventually gives the mayor. I would advocate passage in the city of laws requiring parental consent for minors and informed consent for women.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Dinkins, you have the floor on this matter.
I obviously have a different perspective, different point of view. I was the only candidate for mayor who marched in Washington on April 9th for freedom of choice. My philosophy and attitude in this regard is different than that of Mr. Hewes. May I hasten to say that I respect his right to have his point of view. It's one that is not mine, but there are many who agree with him. The cardinal agrees with him. The mayor agrees with me. The mayor also makes the observation that Rudolph Giuliani says that his posture has evolved over time. The mayor suggests that what has really happened is that he has compromised with his conscience in order to seek votes. And if that be true, it is a sad circumstance.
Thank you, Mr. Dinkins. Now we come back to Mr. Gustavo Godoy, and he has a question for Mr. Dinkins. Mr. Dinkins, the question I have is the following: with more than $15 million deficit, as a mayor, how would you implement health programs for AIDS, expand safety programs, police programs, anti-drug programs? Where would you get the money?
I didn't get the number in the beginning. What was the number you were anticipating? How much?
A deficit of almost $1 billion.
All right. Well, we're not quite sure what the deficit is, but you're right, it is going to be large, whether it's $500 million or $1 billion. And among the things that we must do to address this budget gap is to look to the mayor's private sector survey, the Kerry survey so-called. Persons from the private sector that came together to examine how we do things, look at our management and productivity. And they learned, for instance, that we could save as much as $3 billion in expense and capital money over a 5-year period. As a matter of fact, something approaching $170 million in expense money alone could be served in the net in the first year. We need to look at such things. Even now, much of last night, those from the media who were at the event that I had might have noticed that I spent considerable time going back and forth to the telephone, because we are, even as I speak, negotiating, trying to save the Coliseum deal. That's worth $250 million, $247 million. And if we're able to persuade the plaintiffs there to withdraw that suit, it'll be a big hunk of money. We should not have funded the budget in this fashion. That was wrong in the beginning, and I said so at the time. But that's among the things, among the things that we must do.
I find myself in the extraordinary position here of trying to find things that I disagree with David on, but I would essentially agree with him that we must have a commitment in this city to changing the way the city does business. And in virtually every city office that you go into, there are people who are doing nothing or doing something that has very little value. The city itself is not computerized at this point. They don't even have touch-tone telephones. Space utilization in the city is designed by a maniac. And we can, in fact, fund what needs to be done in the city of New York if we reorganize city government and make it much more efficient. The people of New York are not undertaxed. It is simply that the money is not being well spent. And the next mayor must have a true commitment to making these kinds of changes and to fighting the very difficult fights that will be necessary to impose them on the city bureaucracy.
Thank you, Mr. Hewes. The next question is also for you, candidate for the Republican Party, not that you represent officially, but on an independent ticket as a candidate for the right to life. This question comes
Thank you very much.
Mr. Steinbeck.
Mr. Hewes, President Bush, who holds a position, a right to life position that is consistent with yours, recently vetoed a measure that would have provided federal funds to poor women who found themselves pregnant as a result of a rape or incest and wanted to have an abortion. Should the government, the federal government, provide special funds to care for the babies that result from these pregnancies?
First, President Bush and I don't hold an identical position because he is opposed to abortion except in the cases of rape and incest in the life of the mother, whereas the only exception that I will make is when the life of the mother is involved. The federal government should not make provision for funding any abortions whatsoever. You're not providing a service or doing a favor to someone by reaching out and killing their baby. And the government does, however, have an obligation to ensure that all children in our society get a decent break at a decent life. And that means if, in fact, the parents are unwilling or unable to care for the child, I think that there is very little disagreement from any quarter that the state has an obligation to step in and provide that kind of support. I might say that in New York City this is an issue because in New York City there are thousands and thousands of children today who are living lives of quiet desperation in drug-addicted families in which the city of New York has not had the energy to reach out. And I think this is something that the next mayor is going to have to address because these children are in fact the future of the city.
Excuse me, shouldn't there be funding for therapeutic cases in abortion? As this is a medical type question.
Well, I'm opposed to abortion because I believe that a human life exists at conception, and therefore every life is sacred and every life must be defended equally. The only place where an abortion is a possibility for me is where the life of the mother is endangered and the life of the fetus is endangered, and then a medical decision has to be made as to which life will be saved. But I believe that no matter what the condition of a human life, that every life is equal. I hope I didn't take your time there, David.
Yes, Mr. Dinkins.
My position, of course, is not that of the President nor Mr. Hewes. I have a different position. But the President who says that he is in favor of abortion in a circumstance of incest or rape, yet seems to feel that if you're poor, this doesn't apply to you in the sense that government ought not assist you. Now, Mr. Hewes' position is consistent. he believes that you'd be taking a life. I understand that. I disagree, but I understand. I do not understand the president's posture, however, since he says that he agrees with abortion, the right to an abortion where there is rape or incest, but thinks somehow or other that those who are poor, $110, $125 would solve that problem. He doesn't think that's necessary. So my question is, did Mr. Giuliani ask the president when he was with him why he vetoed that provision?
Thank you, Mr. Dinkins. You are going to continue to speak now because there's a question from Mr. Christie of the press. Yes, a question to Mr. Dinkins. At the beginning of the campaign, you regretted that you had acted in some sense incorrectly with regard to your tax statements in 1782. Your Liberal Republican candidate, who's not here, has emphasized this point over the last few weeks. Now, you have recognized that you did not administer your finances properly. Now, how does this compare with the problems that you will have to manage the huge budget of the city of New York?
Well, I think that it is a fair question, and I think that the people of our city, the electorate, certainly recognizes that that of which they speak with respect to income tax returns was almost 20 years ago, and I have explained that time and time again. I think that the public is satisfied, witness the primary. I don't mean that they approve of my behavior. I don't approve of my behavior. I've apologized for it many times, and it has not happened since, nor will it ever happen again. With respect to the more recent controversy, discussion around the value of stock, it seems to me that I spent at least 2 hours, close to 2 hours, answering questions from all of the media, 40, 50 reporters, and many times since. And I think that the public is satisfied there really was nothing wrong. And so therefore, there's no need for concern as I go in to become mayor, should I succeed on the 7th. I have indicated by some of those persons already assisting me the kind of superb quality talent that will be assisting and advising me, people like Felix Rohatyn.
You can go on a few more seconds if you will.
Well, the point is that Felix Rohatyn, Jim Robinson, Joe Flom, Reginald Lewis. Reginald Lewis is the African-American who leveraged the European buyout at about $1 billion. This is the quality of person that will be assisting me. Indeed, the transition effort that I have now is headed by Nat Leventhal, president of Lincoln Center, one-time first deputy mayor. So one can see even now the quality of people for whom I reach.
Thank you, Mr. Dinkins. The equal time will be given to both candidates, of course. The next question.
Don't I get I get a response
to rebuttal?
After your rebuttal.
Okay. There are many reasons why I feel that I would make a better mayor than Dave Dinkins. Most of them relate to my positions on the issues, on things like pornography, AIDS education in schools, the way in which the city should be organized. I think, however, that these issues about 20-year-old tax returns have very little to do with who's going to make the better mayor in New York, and I think that it's been a disservice to the people of the city that the press has occupied most of the focus of this campaign on discussions of David Dinkins' 20-year-old tax returns rather than on a focused discussion of the issues. I think that the issues and the future course of the city is truly important to the people of New York, and that's what this campaign should have focused on, and I hope that's what it does focus on in the next week.
Yes, now, Mr. Godoy, my question goes to Mr. Dinkins. Mr. Dinkins, on several occasions you have been accused of not being well informed regarding city affairs. On one occasion, you proposed reducing sales taxes. Now, what sort of plan do you have? How can you convince the public you've overcome this weakness, if it is a weakness, and that you are, in fact, fully aware of the problems of the city and that you'll be able to fulfill a role as mayor?
Well, if The reference that I made to income tax was a casual comment at a breakfast seized upon by one of my Democratic opponents in the primary. The simple point that I was making was that a sales tax is a more regressive tax than is an income tax, period. But if one seizes upon that with the suggestion that somehow or other I lack knowledge about municipal affairs, imagine where that puts Rudolph Giuliani. He's a fella who said in the space of 7 or 8 days, he called for a deputy mayor for economic development and a deputy mayor for policy and planning. I'm sure that Stanley Grayson, the deputy mayor for economic development, and Bob Esnard, the deputy mayor for policy and planning, were taken aback to find out that Mr. Giuliani did not know that they exist and did not know that those offices exist. My knowledge of municipal government is seen in my record. I've negotiated budgets. Mr. Giuliani has the luxury of standing afar and being critical, whereas I have to work at it every day.
If you please want to save time for your rebuttal, sir.
I think that the critical issue in New York is not the intellectual capacity of David Dinkins, Rudolph Giuliani, or Henry Hewes to be mayor of New York. The critical issue is a commitment to fundamental change in the way the city of New York does business. And in this campaign, I have very often spoken to reporters and challenged them to discuss the real differences and issues between Dinkins and Giuliani. I don't think that there are many. I think that Dinkins and Giuliani really would follow a similar course to Ed Koch. There would be differences in temperament. There would be differences in accent. And I think that I represent a real commitment to changing the way that the city of New York does business. And I think that that's the critical issue, not who is best informed about municipal affairs. Right on.
Thank you, Mr. Hewes. I have the impression that the next 2 questions should be addressed to Mr. Hewes in order to keep the same rhythm. Sheila Steinbach, Channel 11.
Mr. Hewes, the doors of the City University of New York have opened in recent years to educate a large number of Latino and African American students. Many of them are among the working poor. Their parents, they're older than the typical student we had seen in CUNY in previous years. What is your position on restoring free tuition to CUNY?
I was for several years the vice chairman of the City University's student organization, and I absolutely believe that the City University is a key to the future development of the city and its people. And I am an unremitting advocate of free tuition. It is the best bargain that we could possibly pay. David Dinkins was talking last week about restoring free tuition for the community colleges, and it was stated that approximately $60 million is raised in tuition. That doesn't even count the amount of money that's reimbursed by the state through the tuition assistance program. If you take that out of the equation, you're talking about a $30 million bill for free tuition at community colleges. And at that point, we have to begin to ask which has a higher priority in the city, free tuition in community colleges or public financing of campaigns, because the numbers are roughly equal. And I think that free tuition is something the city needs. It needs it because the City of University of New York must continue to be the mobility machine that permits people entering the city to become part of the middle class and part of the leadership of the city. So I'm 100% for free tuition, not only in community colleges, but also in senior colleges. And while that's not something we could institute immediately under the budget crisis, it is something that we ought to move toward over a period of time relentlessly.
Mr. David Dinkins.
Well, as you all know, I commented last week on the occasion of the receipt of the endorsement of many, many students from a variety of schools, including CUNY. And one of the things that they favor, and one of the things that I favor, is free tuition, ultimately. I was part of the effort that helped get the reduction, the threatened raise, at least, of $200 in tuition that did not happen, thanks to the governor and others, that didn't come about. When I commented that I was in favor of free tuition and said at the time that certainly this couldn't happen tomorrow, it would take time, we can't fund it now, Mr. Giuliani said that this was a cruel hoax. I was giving people hope where I shouldn't. I think he's dead wrong. I think that we ought to have hope.
They're getting tougher, David.
We shall go on to the next panelist, Mr. Esteban Creste, Diario La Prensa, and I believe his question is addressed to Mr. Hewes. Yes. Mr. Hewes, you have been quoted by the press as having said that you were against sexual education programs and AIDS prevention programs in schools. Now, it's the theory of people like you who are criticized, who are against abortion, that you are concerned for the life of a unborn baby, but afterwards you are not so concerned. And the question of sexual education, do these programs not offer us the greatest hope to prevent abortions, in fact?
I don't think so. Sexual education was sold to the United States on the concept that if we provided more education about sex, we would reduce the number of teenage pregnancies. Exactly the opposite has happened. We have instituted a tremendous program of sex education. We haven't reduced teenage pregnancies, and in fact there's no evidence on a coordinated basis that the amount of sex education has any impact at all on the amount of unwanted pregnancy. The AIDS courses that are being given under the state program in the city of New York are shocking. I dare say everybody here today, if they really went and listened to one of these things, would be shocked. I think that it's wrong that sexual education or AIDS education be provided in the public school system without a moral content. And my objection to sex education and AIDS education in the schools is that it is mandated as not having a moral content. And I think that to force parents to subject their children to graphic descriptions of how one can have safe homosexual sex at a very young age is an invasion of the family and of the role of the family in nurturing people. I think that we must at the very least move to make these kinds of programs discretionary.
Thank you, Mr. Hewes. Mr. Dinkins.
Well, Mr. Hewes and I are apart on this issue. I think that sex education and AIDS education is very important. As a matter of fact, some of the very first money for radio and television ads with respect to AIDS education came from the Manhattan Borough President's budget, $300,000. I do think it's important, and I think that we need sex education in our schools as well. I understand and appreciate that there are those who have a different philosophy. I do not disagree, however, that we need to get back to times of teaching values and right and wrong and family and all the rest. And I say that most seriously.
Thank you, Mr. Dinkins. We shall now take the questions from the panel. Mr. Godoy, once again, who do you wish to speak to? Should like to address Mr. Dinkins. 1 out of 4 residents of New York City lives under the poverty level. This is, now, if you are elected mayor, what will you do in order to alleviate this situation? Well,
you're right. Not only do 1 out of 4 Latinos live in such circumstances, a similar percentage of African Americans and many Asians do as well. As a matter of fact, there are 144,000 Jews who live in poverty, 70% of them children and their families. I care about all poor people. I care about all people. And what I intend to do is to pursue a rationale that I think I can sell to those who are fiscally conservative. It is not difficult to point out that many things really save money. Example, the state has a fund of money, about $2 million, and they will match dollar for dollar monies that municipalities put in for preventive services to save so-called at-risk families from coming apart. If those families come apart, children are then placed in foster care at a cost of $10,000 to $12,000 per child per year. This program costs only about $2,000 to keep a family together, and the municipal money gets matched dollar for dollar with money from the state. It is this kind of an approach, preventive measures, that I think we need to do to help provide some of the help and assistance that poor families need. We need to one, start with the theory that it is an obligation of government.
You know, traditionally it's thought that the best way to help poor families is to give them some money. I disagree with that. I think that the problem of most people in New York who are poor is the welfare system that currently exists. I think it discourages people from working, discourages people from participating in the productive engine of our society. I think we have to go back to giving people the dignity and self-respect that they get from work. And I think the most important thing that the city could do would be to move to adjust the welfare system, to make it a job fair system, and to require people to do some productive labor in order to participate. And that, I think, would move people inexorably into the world of production and offer them some hope for the future. And I think that's the kind of change we need to make in the city.
Thank you, Henry Hewes. Sheila Steinbeck now has the floor. We have a member of the panel who speaks English. Since this is a bilingual debate, it will be translated into Spanish. I shall ask the candidates to please wait until I tell you when to start, otherwise there will be a crossover of the languages. So, Sheila, you have the question, I think, from Mr. Hewes.
Okay, thank you very much. Mr. Hewes, David Dinkins is proposing a 1% budget cut across the board to begin dealing with the budget deficit. How would you deal with the budget deficit, and what kind of signals would you send to the citizens of New York and the financial community that everything's in good hands should you be elected mayor?
Well, I think that Mayor Koch's program to deal with the first $500 million of the deficit is essentially a positive step. I'm opposed to across-the-board cuts because I think that they cut the good with the bad. So I would make a commitment to cutting the amount of money necessary out of new hires in the next year, which there are planned to be about 10,000, and to making the sacrifices and forcing the changes on the city bureaucracy that are necessary to make that kind of saving.
Mr. Dinkins.
The 1% across-the-board cut of which you speak does not quite accurately portray my position. What I did was to make the comment that it could be that cuts as deep as 1% might be required, and perhaps more. That didn't mean everything. It exempts police and fire, for instance. And there's some things that we can't cut because they're mandated. There are other things that if we were to cut, it would be counterproductive because they produce matching funds. With respect to the $530 million amendment to the mayor's financial plan, that's something on which the Board of Estimate members must vote because we need a budget modification. It was laid over last Thursday at the request of the mayor. I think it is a good framework and have said so formally. There is about $50 or $60 million, however, of that I think might be done differently.
Thank you, Mr. Dinkins. We shall follow the order of the panelists, and Esteban has the floor. Yes, on the across-the-board cuts, the New York deficit is somewhere between $500 million and $1 billion. The educational system has a budget of $6,000 million. Do you think that something can be done in this area to solve the deficit system, or do you have some other approach with respect to the educational system in particular?
Well, you're right, the education budget is knocking on the door of the $6 billion, not million. I don't see taking any money from education. I see saving money within the education budget to use in education, but not to take money from education, not to try to reduce that budget and use those monies elsewhere. I spent an hour with Joseph Fernandez, the new chancellor coming in January. I liked him very much. Of course, I was a bit biased because he, at the outset, indicated that he'd read my 2 reports done by a commission on education headed by Tony Alvarado And on that commission was Bernie Meklowitz, who is the current chancellor. See, we agree in these reports with such things as school-based management and some of the observations that Jose Serrano has made and gotten into law. And we need more of such things with respect to conflicts of interest and such. So if anything, I want to help education more. I might add that the Puerto Rican community, unlike some other communities, places education as the #1 priority.
Yes.
Well,
are you saying there would not be a what percent cut?
No, you may cut some areas more than 1%, but it is a scaffold you need and not a cleaver.
A small clarification in Spanish. When we say 1,000 million, it's the equivalent of $1 billion in the English.
Well, you said
so there was not really a
million?
misunderstanding of the figure there.
For the audience, he said I thought he was saying that the education budget was $6 million, and he was saying it was 6,000 million. Again, no?
$6 billion is $6 million.
Okay.
Yes.
In the past, there's been a sort of a rule that no matter what happens with the rest of the budget, you don't cut education. I don't think that's correct. I think that the education system should be considered along with all the rest of the city services, and a specific decision should be made as to how much money should be spent in each area rather than exempting some areas for cuts. I personally feel that our public education system needs to be drastically revamped, and would propose such things as elimination of the central board and creation of 50 or 60 local boards. I would propose school vouchers and a range of other reforms that I think are necessary to bring a completely bankrupt system to the point where it offers a quality education to every child in New York, which is not where we are now. That's it.
Very well. Thank you. Continuing on the subject of our debate, we shall ask the journalists who are here in large numbers to put questions they wish. We have selected 3 persons, and I shall ask Shelley Strickler, Dominic Carter to identify themselves and the press that they represent.
WCBS Radio. New York City streets are clogged with noise and cars and dirt. The quality of life, most would agree, has seriously declined over the past few years, perhaps as many as 10 years. As a matter of fact, Mr. Dinkins, right around the corner from your campaign headquarters, prostitution is a thriving business at night. What specifically...
You mean just down the street from the New York Times?
Absolutely. Nonetheless, on the streets of New York City, what specifically will keep the commuters from coming, because they're concerned as well, the residents from fleeing, and the businesses from fleeing as well, both of you?
Shall I respond first?
Yes.
Well, the reason that I made the reference to the Times is that my campaign office has been but recently located there. The New York Times has been in its location for quite a while. It seemed to me a bit much to describe that area as being close to my campaign headquarters, since there was another way that we might have fixed the point of reference. But there is, it is a legitimate concern, and I maintain that some businesses that threaten to leave or may not come here, while they are concerned with such things as land costs and energy costs, they are as well concerned with quality of life. And these things are the areas, frankly, that all of the candidates, Mr. Giuliani included, wish to address. We may not all agree on how to address them, but this is what we really should have been talking about throughout this campaign. With respect to crime and drugs, most people know that my plan is to double the number of community patrol officers in my first term, to put a cop on every subway train every night. I'm seeking money for drug treatment. We recognize that 83% of those who go through central booking test positive for substance abuse. Pat Moynihan and I offered a proposal which the Senate has adopted so that Medicaid money can be used for drug treatment. For cocaine. It is used now for methadone, for heroin, but not cocaine. It is illogical to be such.
Thank you, sir. I'd like to give the opportunity to Mr. Hewes to answer the question. We shall ask the person who's controlling the little bill to provide the ring, to get the ring after 60 seconds. You have the floor, sir.
Okay. New York City, the main threat to New York City's viability are these quality of life issues, and I agree with Mr. Dinkins that that is what really makes business flee from our city. But my concern in this campaign is that while both Mr. Dinkins and Mr. Giuliani have indeed talked about the need to make these changes, to do something about crime and something about drugs, that this campaign has not focused on the magnitude of these problems. We have hundreds of thousands of drug addicts, and we are going to have to provide some kind of treatment for hundreds of thousands of drug addicts. We have 50,000 criminals on the street who do nothing but career crime. These people are going to have to be incarcerated, and we have no jails. We have no detention centers for juveniles. We have none of the kind of backup that the criminal justice system needs to be effective. And whereas I hear Mr. Giuliani saying, we'll put a few thousand more policemen on the street and we'll arrest all the drug pushers, he's not talking about what you're going to do with these people after they're arrested. And I think that...
Thank you. We shall now go to another member of our numerous journalistic attendants, Shelley Strickler.
Shelley Strickler, WOR Radio, Mr. Dinkins, Mr. Hewes. If I may be so bold, I would like to take the place of the empty chair and ask Mr. Dinkins a question as though I were Rudolph Giuliani. David, you have not proven your competency during your years in public service. I believe you are seeking this office to have fun and not to roll up your sleeves. What concrete evidence can you offer New Yorkers that you are indeed up to this office?
Well, it's unfortunate that the fellow who didn't show up gets somebody to put his questions for him. But frankly, I think that my service as Manhattan Borough President alone would suggest to the people, the electorate of our city, that I'm equal to the task. We on the Board of Estimate deal with all of the issues that a mayor has to deal with. We have different powers. We don't have that executive ability, not as fully as a mayor. One of the reasons I seek this office. But I've been dealing with very difficult issues for a long period of time, and I've done sufficiently well at it to be a creditable candidate for mayor. Indeed, I won a primary against 3 formidable foes. And so I think that the people believe that I'm equal to the task. I hope that the total electorate thinks so, and we'll know on November 7th, that night.
I don't even think that if Rudy Giuliani was here, that he would have the nerve to ask that question.
Thank you.
Well, I think it would be fair to ask Mr. Hewes, how would he qualify as a mayor of New York with so little of following and lack of background?
How I would qualify? I don't think there's anybody who has heard me campaign or has interviewed me or has talked to me about the issues involved in the city of New York who would disagree with the proposition that I have enough knowledge about the city of New York to be mayor. But as I said before, I don't think that's the critical issue. I think the critical issue in this election is a willingness to change the way that the city does business. And I think that is what the city of New York should be electing, is someone who represents change and someone who represents a return to the kind of moral values that made this country a great and powerful and good country. And so that would be my answer to the question.
Dominique Cannon, the next journalist is going to put a question to either of the candidates, and the other person, will be able to answer it as well.
My name is Dominic Carter, and I'm a radio reporter for WLIB and WBLS here in New York. My question for the two of you, starting with Mr. Dinkins. Most debates, we don't hear about this topic, and it's a major one in the African American and Latino community. It deals with police brutality. While these communities depend on police officers, and some might say for the most part have a good working relationship. Another concern is the morale of police officers and how they deal with community members. As mayor, what would either one of you gentlemen do to change the relationship between the community and the department and to cut back on police brutality?
Well, it is a very important area. I have tried always, when I have been critical of the police, and I have been on occasion, Eleanor Bumpers, Michael Stewart, Juan Rodriguez, I've spoken out at those times. But each time I tried to use great care to make the point that I believe that the vast number of women and men who make up the New York City Police Department are good, honest, hard-working people who put their lives on the line for all of us every day. Having said that, it still is important that it be understood that it is illegal to use excessive force. Among the things that I would seek to do as mayor, first of all, I'd select the police commissioner who was of like mind, certainly. And I'd want the word to go down that not only may you not use excessive force, that goes without saying, but the police ought to be courteous as well. So many instances where there's a lack of courtesy escalate into brutality. There's more when time permits.
I think that David is fundamentally right, is that the mayor has to set a tone for the police department and make sure that the police department understands that not only when dealing with blacks and Latinos, but in dealing with any citizen of the city, that the police have an obligation to be polite, and they have an obligation to use the minimum force necessary in any situation. That being said, however, in many of the Latino and black neighborhoods in the city of New York, the police force functions almost like an occupying army. And I think that we have to get back to making the police force part of the community and creating the kinds of bonds between the police force and the community that will create confidence, understanding, and compassion. And that's also something, I think, which has to flow from the mayor and is going to be done over a period of years and not in any kind of flash.
Well, thank you very much. Well, how fortunate we have a few minutes left for questions. I know the panel is well prepared to do so. And Esteban, if you would like to speak first. Mr. Dinkins, with regard to the new city charter, this would confer greater powers to the new mayor. And how would you look upon the situation after having had many years of a mayor in a different position? Once the mayor does occupy such a position, what would you do about legislation on the control of legislation for the control of commercial rent, which you have addressed? Commercial
so
rent.
Your basic question is, what is my position with respect to commercial rent?
Actually, there are two questions.
One is the charter, and the other is, okay. Well, first off, I favor commercial rent arbitration. I'm in favor of the legislation as offered by the next borough president of Manhattan, Councilmember Ruth Messinger and Stanley Michaels. I think that's needed. There are many, many bodegas that just cannot manage with escalating rents without some protection like that. Many, many Korean merchants face the same circumstance. There's a lot more in this area, but let me get to charter, as I figure I have 60 seconds or less. I am a candidate for mayor that has favored a continuation of the Board of Estimate, recognizing that we can't have that. I sought to make certain kinds of changes. We have not achieved all that I would have wished, but I cannot urge anyone to vote against the charter, because I fear that that would then leave us with a court determining the Constitution of the City of New York for decades to come. So while I am displeased with certain aspects of it, overall I come down on the side of urging people to vote in favor of it, with the hope that in subsequent years we will make amendments that will satisfy some of the things with which I'm concerned.
Okay. In terms of commercial rent control, I'm opposed to commercial rent control of any kind. I think that it freezes the mobility of who sells what and in what stores, and I would remind, I think, everybody that if you had commercial rent control 20 years ago, the bodegas wouldn't exist, that in fact the City of New York should be as dynamic as possible. With reference to the charter, I oppose the charter. I think that the new charter is a failure in an effort to revitalize and change city government. I don't see anything, any damage in waiting and referring the charter back to a new charter review commission and voting on this after a little more time has passed. So I would urge everyone to vote against the new charter.
Very well, thank you. We have about 6 minutes left, and there is a minute and a half for a final statement on the part of each of the candidates. We have time for just one more question, if it is a brief one. Sheila, you have the floor for this brief question and a brief answer. And then we'll have the
very brief question. In New Jersey, where we are right now, there is a law that provides for a minimum of 2 debates in a campaign that is, of course, financed largely by the public. And you, Mr. Dinkins, and Mr. Giuliani are both receiving campaign funds. Would you be in favor of such a law being enacted in New York?
I would, if such a law would not exclude candidates. I make the observation that I debated not once, not twice, but 4 times in the primary, and we were getting public money then too. And I debated Ravitch and Golden along with Koch at a time when Koch said that Ravitch and Golden were not factors in the contest. It seems to me that it would be at least unfair, and it certainly would run against the principles. I come from a background of people who have been excluded. To say to Mr. Hewes that because I disagree with his views, he ought not be here to express them, I don't buy that at all. So that I would be in favor of such a law if it permitted the participation of all legitimate candidates. He certainly is such.
Actually, I'm opposed to public campaign financing in the first place. I'd rather see the money go into free tuition at the City University or to feed children. I don't think that debates ought to be mandated by the law. Debates ought to be mandated by the press, and the press ought to inform the people of the city when one candidate or another is ducking. And I think that the fact that David Dinkins is here and Henry Hewes is here and that Rudolph Giuliani is not is very good evidence as to who's ducking in this particular campaign.
Yes, if you please. We are close to conclusion of the debate. As I had promised, we shall conclude with a final statement on the part of each of the candidates. David Dinkins has been designated at random, so you have the floor, sir.
Thank you very much. Again, I want to thank the sponsors and all the participants. You know, I thought about a closing statement, and at first I was going to have a closing statement that would put questions to Mr. Giuliani and say, were you here, I'd ask you this and this and that and the other, but I think we've covered to some degree some of those kinds of things. So instead, let me speak to your viewers and listeners in a different fashion. Let me say that I want to be mayor because I think that I can improve circumstances in our town. I know that I can bring people together in superior fashion to others. The fashion in which Democrats came together following the primary was that which has been unseen in our town in recent times, and I think that's tremendously significant. We have to understand that the real enemy is crime and drugs and poverty and an education system that does not well serve our children, and AIDS and all the rest. Even as we sat here waiting for this program to start, Mr. Hewes and I discussed, he said, after this election's over, we're going to talk about education in the CUNY system. He's got some great ideas, and I'm very much interested. This is really what we ought to be about.
Well, I'm going to end with a capsule version of what I tell people, which is that elections are not only about who wins and who loses, that they create the context for government and the society. And I think in this election, the most important thing is a commitment to change and a commitment to reinvigoration of traditional morality. And without wanting to say anything negative about either Mr. Giuliani or about Mr. Dinkins, 10.
We're running short of time.
All right, I believe that I stand for change, and most of all, I stand for guaranteeing the civil rights and the lives of unborn babies, and votes for me will be counted both as votes for change and as votes for those who cannot speak for themselves. Thank you.
We thank everybody for their presence in this debate. Thank you very much.
Following the debate in New York this morning, Democratic mayoral candidate David Dinkins held a brief news conference.
Are we ready?
Yep. Mr. Dinkins,